Begin the current Daf, Mesechtes Nedarim Daf Samachet. Begin on the top line of the Amud, where the Gemara continues the discussion of the previous Daf. We opened up the 10th Perek Naim Rasam with this halacha when a girl is engaged, her father and the husband can be made for neder together. So we had interpretation number one, was that of Rabbah, which he learned out from, we quoted 9 psukim. The first paragraph was talking about the father being made for when she's single. The last paragraph was talking when she's married and the husband does it himself. Well, what's the middle one? So we went through in great detail. So the middle one is when she's engaged, somewhere in the middle, twilight zone, and actually she needs both, a via baila, to made from the Nadarim. That was Rabbah's interpretation. Now the Gemara is going to continue with a different source of this halacha of Nedarim Daf, a via baila from the Nadarim. Where do we know it from? That of the Tana, the Beri Bishmal. Some of the things discussed in today's daf are, like we said, Bishmal's source for Nedarim Rasa, that a via balma from the Dereha, that when she's an engaged girl, her father and the husband made for it together. And then we get into a very interesting lamdisha question in the Gemara itself. So you're telling me that there's 2 partners, father and husband. You need both of them to be able to make for the neder. When one of them is made for, what actually happens? Do we say that Megiz Gayis, the one partner who does the mefer, does complete removal of half, or is it mikdash kolish? That no, it's not quantitative, but it's more qualitative. It's like the whole thing, the whole neder becomes weakened. And the Gemara actually concludes that this question actually machlekes b'sham basil in the brayso if it's megiz guys or mikdash kolish. Now, a husband, and in some instances even a father, has the authority in general for the halacha of hafar b'yem shamai. He can be made for it on the day that he hears about it. That's it. You have a 24-hour time period. In contrast to hataras nadarim, you go to the chacham whenever you want to. But this halacha b'fara of just totally abolishing it, it's only the day you hear about it. Now, hakama, which is the opposite of substantiating the neder, is either b'dibur, where he says, yes, I want it to be, or by being quiet. B'yoim shamai, if he's quiet the whole day that he hears about it, that itself will be considered as hakama. Now, Mishnah Daf Ayin Beis, it gets way more complicated as we go along in this parak. There's a halacha called nisreikna, which basically means to say means to empty out. So if the father dies, what happens now? You only have one partner left. So loy nisreikna shis labal. The Oris does not take over the father's koyach regarding this neder. Whereas meisa bal, if let's say the chassan passed away, nisreikna shis la'av. The father does take over the koyach of the Oris regarding this neder, and then he has the authority himself, because again, one partner passed away. What happens now? That's halacha that we'll see of nisreikna, and that's where our Gemara continues right now. So we're on the top line of the Amud Daf Samaches. We had said in the Mishnah, Naim Ros Avil Abayil Mafin Nederah. Rabbah, we said, he derived the halacha from Muhayisi Leish Nederah, like we said. Now the Gemara brings the Meir Bishmal Tana. Top line Daf Samaches. In Yeshiva Bishmal, they taught the following price. It says a pasuk in Midbar, it says that these are the chukim. This is actually by the end of that parsha that we quoted in the previous daf, which was all these psukim that we spoke about, the parsha in the Nadarim. So that parsha ends by saying these are the statutes that Hashem commanded to Moshe. Bein ish le'ishtoi, between the man and his wife. Bein avla bita, between the father and his daughter. It says Tan Rabbi Shmuel. You know what this pasuk is teaching you? Mikan la'nayim arasa. From here you see by an engaged naira shavia ubayla mafira nederaha, that a father and a husband together are made for the nadarim, which he understands this pasuk talking about naira marasa. Why? From the fact that this pasuk mentions binoreha beisavia in her youth in her father's household, and at the same time the pasuk is talking about a father and the husband. Oh, wait a second. When you have a father and a husband, and you're telling me that they're both up doing hafara, sounds like the Av and the Baal are made for the Nadarim together of the Naira HaMoiras. That's what Tan Rabbi Shmuel learns his source for this halach. Ask the Gemara, Tan Rabbi Shmuel, according to this Tana, Im Hayai Ish. The Gemara just gets technical for a moment because we have 2 different sources. So each one, what does he do with the other one's source? So Rabbah, who had explained the previous daf, the middle paragraph, Im Hayai Ish, my brother, what does he do with this? You tell me you learned it from the pasuk that finishes off the whole parasha over there with Nadarim, that it's that's Tomanar Marasa. So what does he need that whole middle paragraph of 3 psukim talking about, seemingly the way Rabbah explained, of Nair Marasa? Says the Gemara, Mukim Le'idach, and the Ger says the Rabbah. He used it to explain a different teaching of Rabbah, which, as we'll see later on, Daf Ayin Amud Aleph, that the pasuk is comparing before a woman gets engaged a second time to when she gets engaged a first time. What does that mean? before she gets engaged the first time, who's in control? The father. She's single. So the pasuk is coming to compare when the husband dies, nisroiknu reshus la'av, and that's what Rabbi learns out from those psukim, as we'll see. So it's not shver, it's not difficult. What does he do with the psukim? He used the psukim to teach me that just like in the first paragraph, before she was ever engaged, the father was the one that's made for it on his own. When the chassan dies, if she gets engaged to him, but then he dies, it's going to go right back to the father's, in contrast, like we said, it doesn't go the other way. When the father dies, the chassan does not have all control. That's what Tanya Rabbi Shmuel would learn out with those psukim. Now, says the Ran, but Rab himself, he holds that both ideas you learn out from those middle psukim. The primary pasuk is teaching you Nedarim Daf, that Avia Ba'ila Mafir Nedereha, like we explained the previous daf, and the fact that it mentions Hayoisiya, which are two Havayas. Why two Havayas? Like Kushishniya L'Rishayna, to teach how she is before she gets engaged the first time, to how she is before she gets engaged a second time. Why is she getting engaged a second time? Because her chassan died. Oh, that's the halach of Nesreikn, the father's going to come back as it always is. Okay, but then the Ran asks, if you're going to say that since the Tanya Rabbi Shmuel is learning the whole pasuk of Im Hayisiya to teach me this halacha that we're comparing these two havayas, these two engagements, before the first time she gets engaged, before the second time she gets engaged, and not to teach the halacha of a chassan, because that's only learned out from this pasuk finale of Ben Ishlish Ben Avla Bitoy. So then, ask the Ran, where does Tanya Rabbi Shmuel know the halacha of Oris made for B'kaidman? Where do you see that the chassan can be made for what was pre-existing? We know it from, because it says there Nidara Leha, that her pre-existing Nedarim. But according to Rabbi Shmuel, he's not learning the pasuk over there in Nedarim. Where does he know this halacha of Oris made for B'kaidman? Says the Ram, what you could say is that he knows it without a pasuk. Because although the third paragraph excludes a husband from pre-existing Nedarim, like it says that it's only Beveis Bala Nadacha, she took the Neder Beveis Isha, that's only because there's no father. But that's only the case that you're excluding when there's no father, when she's married, when there's no application of the father. So then the husband cannot be made for B'kaidman. But when she's engaged, when the chassan doing the afar with partnership with the father, then even if it's pre-existing, he can be made for because by the father there's no pre-existing. That he quotes from the Chacham, the Vasig, Rabbi Shmuel Zal. So he says that he would know it from a Swara. He wouldn't need it from a pas. Okay. But now the Gemara says, and the Gemara says, V'rabba, Haida Tani Debei B'Shmuel, this pasuk finale that Tani B'Shmuel is learning out from Ben Ishla Ishla Ben Avla Bitoy, where he's learning out this halacha from of Narmarasa. What does Rabba do with it? He doesn't need this pasuk because he knows it already from that middle paragraph, which he's saying is Narmarasa. Says the Gemara, he needs it for something else. He needs it to say, Shabal Meifin Nedarim Shebeinoy Lebeina, that the husband can be Meifin Nedarim that's between him and her. Those are the words Bein Ish LeIshtoi. That's coming to teach you that Nedarim that are between them, those are the type of, because we're going to see later on in this parak, and in the future parak, that there's two types of Nedarim that a husband can be made from. One that's called Nidri Ina Nefesh, which is like she's painting herself. She's like, yeah, I'm not going to eat anymore. I'm not going to. So those things that I'm not showering or whatever it is, that he can be made from. Like it says, Kol Ned v'choshvus isul la'anis nefesh. Then our pasuk of Bein Ish LeIshta is necessary to say that when it's something that affects the relationship, which the Gemara in the next parak, Pei Alpha and Beis is going to explain what those are, but something that affects the relationship, that also can be made for. That's what he's learning out, Rabbah, from this pasuk of Bein Ish LeIshta. Now, it says the Ran, but it's difficult to me. According to Rabbi Shmuel, where does he know things that are between him and her? Because you tell me you're using this pasuk already for the halach of Namrosa of Veba Mefan. Says the Ran, maybe he learns out both from this pasuk. And just the Ran points out, which I'm not going to go into all the quotes he quotes from, but just like a husband, says the Ran, cannot be made for by the Nedarim of his wife, only things that have one of these two criterion, Inu Nefesh, or something that affects the relationship. Says a father also cannot be made for the Nedarim of his daughter, only these two types of categories. But he ends up by saying that the Rambam, however, writes that a father can be made for any Nedarim of his daughter. So that's a critical machlokes Rishonim. Regarding what type of a Nedarim could a father be made for by his daughter. Okay. Now explaining this halacha of our Mishnah, which we said that we have this partnership, father and chassan together, so holding hand in hand, they're like partners together. If this woman takes a neder, they need to do a joint hafara to go ahead and be made for. But Iboda, the following interesting question. Baal, which in this context doesn't mean the husband, it means the chassan, the aris, who we said could only be made for only with partnership of the father, when he's made for his portion, megiz gayis, is he cutting? In other words, does he totally cut off half the neder and he nullifies it? And the other half remains strong as it was all the way in the beginning, and it's not weakened at all? Oy miklish kalish. Or do you say that he weakens it? In other words, you don't say that he's cutting off half the neder, that he's nullifying half and the other half remains as it is. Rather, with the hafar of the aris, he's just weakening the entire neder. Which the Ran just points out, although we're asking it by a chassan, the same we could have asked it by the father, we're just picking one of the two variables. It's either chassan or it's the father. It's either one. Doesn't make a difference. Not specifically chassan, although we will see differences regarding chassan and father. But in this context, the Gemara's question, it doesn't make a difference. We just happened to pick the chassan, but we could have asked it by the father too. Okay, that's the question. But then the Gemara says, Heicha kame bailan. In other words, what's the ramification? What's the difference? Who cares? Seemingly, it wouldn't make a difference how it's happening, the mechanism. Ultimately, you need both, and until both do, nothing really happened. So the Gemara says, no, I'll tell you where the ramification is. Very interesting question. She took a neder that she's not eating. There was 2 olives left on the table. And then this family loved olives. It was a special type of olive. And she says to her husband, she goes, this kala, she's engaged. And the chassan's over for a suda, it's all exciting, and he's there, and there's 2 more olives, and she loves olives, and he's also, that's what they actually got engaged with, an olive store, who knows, whatever. And she takes a neder, she goes, I take a neder, I'm not eating these 2 olives. Okay. The Shama Agas, the chassan hears about it, says, no, Malki, you have to have these olives, you love it, and let's do some microdosing, you get whatever, and v'heifala, he nullifies the vafra. And then, v'achal tanan, she eats both olives. Now, amrin and megiz guy is if you say when the chassan does his hafara, he's slicing off half. Salakia, she should get lashes. Why? So the Ran explains. Although with the hafara of the aris, it removes an isser of one of the 2 olives, because we said he literally cuts off half the neder, the other one remains as it is. And the other one she'll get lashes for. Now, however, says the Ran, since we don't know which one is the one that remains, it's not like distincting which one is. So she won't get lashes until she eats both. But if she eats both, she'll get lashes for one of them. But if you say miklish kalish, he weakens the whole thing. So then he's still balmuhu. It's just a prohibition. There's not going to be malchus because the whole neder was weakened, and it's just like a generic isser. But you can't give her malchus because she didn't violate a bona fide neder. Now the Ran says, which is a little parenthetical, but the Ran says that there are those who ask, why do you need to pick a case of 2 olives? The Gemara says in Shavuos Daf Chabezim and after, our Papa says, when it comes to Nedarim, you get malchus even for a mashu. So why would you pick a zayas, which sounds like there's a minimum shiur over here of the size of an olive? Because it's not really olives necessarily, it's a shiur of an olive. So he says, well, first of all, there is a mandam over there that holds that even by kainamis, by Nedarim, you don't get malchus until there's kezayis. So we picked that case, Tam L'Rav Kedabelson, to include even that mandam. Or he says, we actually picked it for Shavua, because included neder are Shavuos, as the Gemara said of Chesam and Alf, neder godol neder l'keiso, which is really a Shavua. And a Shavua, even that's less than the shiur, there's no malchus. It would have to have a kezayis. Or a third approach, he says, that this that we say loik over here, it actually doesn't mean malchus, it actually means a carbon, which is regarding the halach of me'ilah, where according to everyone, there's no carbon less than the shiur. And we find that the word yilka could mean also a carbon. So again, those are 3 different approaches why we're picking dafka zayis. But that's our question. Mai says, what's the halacha going to be? Is it megiz gayis or is it miklish kalish? Says the Gemara Toshima. Let's bring a raya. The Brisa says as follows: Amru, when did they say? And this is a little bit complicated. These halachas, we're going to get to it later on in this Masechta. Meisabal. When did they say that if the husband dies, nisroikner rishus la'av? So then the rights get emptied out, like the Mefarish says, like a person who's pouring out wine from one vessel to another one. In other words, that it gets totally removed from the rishus, from the Baal, and it comes to the rishus of the Av. And again, this is a little bit halting cup, a little bit complex, but that's the question of the Gebraisa. We know there's halacha if the chassan dies, it gets emptied back out, the father takes over all rights. When did we say this? So there's actually 3 criterion when we said this. First of all, it's Bizman Shalei Shama Habal Koidim. We're talking about where the Chassan didn't hear Koidim Shiyamas. Before he passed away, the Chassan didn't hear about this neder that his Kala took. Let's say she took a neder, she wanted a refuah shleima for a Chassan who was not feeling well. I swear, whatever she said, that I'm going to tell him for the next, 50 years straight, whatever it is now. Never going to miss a day. So the Chassan didn't hear about it. Or, second variable is, and the girsa is different than the way it's printed, it's the way, Ishashama, that he heard, but for Hafar, this is how the Bach says, he heard, but either Vahafar, he nullified the vow, Oy Shashama Veshasik, or he heard and he was quiet. So far there was no Hakama. So it's talking about either the Chassan didn't hear about it before he died, or he heard but he nullified it, or he heard and he was quiet. Okay. And variable number 3 is Umeis Baybayem. He died that day. Now the Ran explains, this says he died that day is specifically going on the case of when he heard and he was quiet. There's specifically only on that day. Why? Because when you're quiet, if a day passes by with you having heard it and being quiet, that's a passive kiyum. That's passively being mekayim it and substantiating it. So then, if the husband was not mekayim it, then the father could still do it hafara. But if let's say he dies the following day, then not, because the husband passively was already mekayim it, and since he was not made for it, he's already revealing his intention that he's okay with it. So therefore, the father who's coming mekoichai, because right, he's emptying out his bucket into his bucket, cannot be made for it because the chassan already was mekayim it. But if he hears and he's made for it, then says the Ran, even if he dies the following day, the father would be able to made for it, because even though that when the husband dies, his afar is batal, and the father has to go ahead and now be made for the chelik of the husband with his own chelik, even so, since the chassan was already made for, so then you can't say that it should be like a hakama regarding the chassan. So even though his afar is batal, but Lamaisa at the end he revealed his intention, he's not okay with it, that neder. What should he have done? He just died. And the Ran says it's also obvious from the Seifa, because the Seifa says, as we'll see, we're going to quote shortly, but im shama v'kayim, if the chassan heard about it and he was mekayim it, or he heard and he was quiet and he died the following day, the Bryce is going to tell us, then the father cannot be mefer. Says the Ran, wait a second. If it's true that when the chassan hears about it and he's mefer, if he dies the following day, the father cannot be mefer anymore, then you should have said, even if the chassan heard and he was mefer, if he died the following day, then the father cannot be mefer. That would have been a bigger chiddush than just hearing and being quiet. Obviously, from the fact it doesn't say that, obviously, says the Ran, it's very important in the understanding that when he hears and he's mefer, then even if he dies the following day, it's still going to empty out to the rishus of the father, and he's going to be able to mefer. It's only for the case of shama v'shasik, because then that's going to be a passive hakama, and that's really the main idea this is saying. If the chassan was not mekayim it, when he dies, the father gets that right, and he could finish off the afara. He'll get the husband's rights. And that's actually what the Brisa says. Zu sheshaninu, this is halacha number 1. This that we learned, Meis Abal, if the chassan died, the rights get emptied out into the father, and he can go ahead and finish off that deal. Now, as Getintam and Beis, Avol, but if Shama v'kayim, let's say the chassan heard about the neder, and he was like, yes, Malki, I want you to keep this neder. Or Shashama v'shasik, well, he heard, but he didn't say anything. But then he lived another 24 hours. Umeis b'yem shalachrav, and he died the following day. The chassan was already mekayim it. Then in yochel hafra. Then the father cannot go ahead and do hafara after the chassan died. Okay. Continues the brisa. Shama avia. If the father heard about it, v'hafra, and the father nullified the vow. It's a little halting cup, holding the space for what all these cases are, the intricacies. The father heard about it and he was made for it. The chassan didn't get a chance to hear about the neder at shemeis ha'av until the father died. This is halacha number 2. This that we learned, meis ha'av, the father dies, loy nisroik nerishos labal. The rights do not get emptied out for the chassan now to take over full control. Which the Ran says, it appears to me that, why are we saying v'lo hispek habal? Why are we saying that the husband didn't get a chance to hear about it until the father died? Why is that important? Let's say he did hear about it. What's the difference? So if he heard about it, why would that make a difference? It says it's a chiddush. That even though these words were not presented ever to the chassan, and therefore in a way he was never zoich in it, he never had any active abilities to it because he never heard about it. He can't be made for something he never heard about it. As the Gemara is going to tell us later on, the Ayin Beis, that when a neder was never yet heard by that chassan, it's not really like anything that he had rights in it yet. So you see that as long as something was not brought up to the party, you almost have a weaker ability in it because you never had any ability to be maver. So you would have thought to say, and again, it's mamish like super fine lumdus over here. You would have thought to say that since the father was mafer and the chassan didn't even hear about it yet, so in a way he was never zeich in it yet, when the father dies, that should weaken the neder very much because the only one that had anything to do with it was the father, and the father was mafer, which obviously weakens it, and now he's dead. So now what's left over is like very little. So you would have thought to say that that little should be enough with the hafara of the Baal because there's very little left to be mafer. Because when the father was alive, the only one who heard about it was the father, and the chassan had nothing to do with it. He didn't even hear about it, and the father was made for it. So now what's left is very little. So you would think to say the chassan can be made for it. Kamash Malan, that no, even this weakened neder for that little bit that's left, no, that's what the Bryce is going to tell us, that the chassan cannot be made for it. And just like we taught you in the Reisha, that even though the neder was not weakened at all, which was if the husband heard about it and he was quiet, which wasn't weakened at all because he was not made for it. Even so, he said the father could be made for. Here also the chiddush is the other way around. That even though it's so weakened and there's almost very little left, no, the chassan cannot be made for. Because like we're saying, the father obviously has more strength than the chassan. That's why it's in the strike in the Rosh Hashanah. But like here we're saying here in this brisa that no, if the father dies, it's not in the strike in the Rosh Hashanah, even if the chassan had not even heard about it, which the Ran's saying that makes it weaker, which should give him a more ability now when the father's dead, because very little that he has to do. No, even that little he can't do. Continues the brisa. Let's say Shama Baila V'Hafala. Let's say the husband heard about the neder, and he was made for the neder. Now the father did not get the opportunity to hear about it until the chassan passed away. And remember, the chassan was made for the neder. This is what we learned. If the chassan dies, halacha number 3, nisreikna rishos la'av. It gets emptied out to the father. So it says the Ran, what's the chiddush of this case, more than we said in the first case? This case of when the chassan was made for it, and the father did not have an opportunity to hear about it, even so, we're saying when the chassan dies, it gets emptied out, it gets given over to the rishos of the father. So he says, the chiddush over here is the v'lo-hispik, that the father didn't get an opportunity to hear about it. Why is that a chiddush? He says, because if that's not the chiddush, he says it's exactly the same thing as we already said in the first halacha. We already spoke about in the struggle in the rishos la'av. So that's the chiddush, that even though the father did not have heard about it, which in a way weakens his ability, so that's the chiddush that no, he can be made for it. So it says around, what do you mean to the contrary? You already said a chiddush, bigger chiddush in the Reisha. You said that at a time when the chassan heard about it and he was quiet, where here he wasn't even quiet, here he was made for it. And you told me that even though the neder was not weakened at all, because to the contrary, of course it wasn't weakened, he was quiet, which is almost going to be a hakama when 24 hours passes. And even so, you told me that nisreik nirshas la'av. So what do you mean? So ask the Ran, kavachem over here, because her neder is as it always was, and of course the father can be made for. So where it's weakened, like in the third case, so because the husband was made for it, and number 2, the father never even saw it, where that gives more strength to the hafara of the chassan, because he's the only one that knows about it. Same way you just told me a moment ago regarding this case number 2. So do I have to tell you that the father can be made for? Moreover, the Ran says, you said in the case of when the father heard about it, that it's a chiddush, that even though the father's mefer and the chassan did not have a good chance to hear about it, like in our case, you told me, which I just referenced a moment ago, that weakens the neder very much, and even so you told me, okay, still the baal cannot be mefer. So if over there the chiddush was in such a case that the chassan cannot be mefer, even though that weakens it so much, so how could it be a chiddush over here, that same exact case, that the father could be mefer? To the contrary, that makes it even weaker. And even when it's stronger, he could be mefer. So what's the chiddush? Says around, yes. On the other hand, most definitely there is a chiddush in this case, and it's not difficult. It says because you could say the words of the Ran are ikal memahachi, ikal memahachi. You could say either way would be a chiddush. It says you could say that since the afar, the first one was a bona fide afara, so therefore, and the reason why the first one was a bona fide afara is because the other party didn't even hear about it. It's called loy niru. So that weakens the neder very much, and there's very little left. And for that little left, you would have thought to say, oh, that should be enough for the afar, the other one. Like we said, we thought that the chassan would be able to get that when the father dies. So that's what tell you the chiddush in the Reisha that no, even that little bit, that does not get emptied out to the husband. However, you could also say a different way. That since the afara of the first one is effective, like we said, since he did afara and the other party didn't even know about it, so that weakened the neder very much. So therefore there's only very little left. But now this is where he shifts. He says, he pivots. He says, oh, so then you could say to the contrary. That little bit, since it's so weak, it's not kedai, it's not even enough for the father to inherit it. It's too weak. It's not enough for him to what are you giving me? There's nothing here to give. And actually, Beis Hillel says such a svar in the next daf in Samach Tes, regarding the last case of this brisa, that he can't be mefer because it's so weakened, the father has nothing to be zeichin. So therefore here also you would have said the same thing in this case number 3. That's the Kamash Malan, that no, even so, it does get emptied out to the father's rishos, because although at the time when the chassan made the hafara, his hafara was bona fide to weaken the neder very much because the father had not yet heard about it, even so, when the chassan dies, so then that actually nullifies his hafara, so like it weakens his weakening, and therefore, there is something here for the father to be zeichen. Whereas by the last case, as we'll see in the next daf, since the father's still there, so that doesn't nullify his hafara. And since the neder gets weakened, so therefore according to Beis Hillel, and we'll see this on the next daf, so meaning on this daf, but for later on, according to Beis Hillel, so he can't be zeicha in the chelka shel baal. And then there's a little bit more that the Ran goes on, but we'll stop at this point, but meaning for this explanation. But that's what the chiddush in this case is, of that it's going to be regular shus la'av, even though the father didn't hear about it, still we're going to say the father's going to inherit. Okay, let's continue. Case number 4. Shama bala v'hafala. Let's say the husband heard about it, and he was made for it. The father did not get the opportunity to hear about it until the father dies. Okay, this is halacha number 4. The husband cannot be made for. Why not? Because the chassan can only make hafara only in a partnership. Says the Ran, this case is telling us a bigger chiddush from what we heard about the case of when Shama Aviya v'Hafrala, when the father heard about it and was mefer, which there also we concluded when the father dies, it does not get nisreikna rishus labal. So the Ran explains what the chiddush of this is, because we understand over there in that prior in the case number 1 that you could say, or case number 2, that although when the father was made for the neder, so that was a bona fide hafara, and therefore that weakens the neder very much, and therefore, like we said, there's very little left, because the husband didn't even hear about it, the husband didn't even hear about it. And even so, we said that when the father dies, so that is substantiates the neder as it was in the beginning, because once the father dies, so therefore his hafara is batal, and there's no substance, and therefore, since it's a very strong neder, it would make sense that the chassan, he's explaining a little bit different than he did there over there, who the chassan doesn't have so much strength, he cannot be mefer. I would understand that would be the halacha over there. But over here, where the neder got very weakened because the chassan was mefer it, and the father never even got a chance to hear about it, and the neder is still in its weakened state because no one ever nullified the chassan's hafara because he's still alive, and he was mefer it, and the father never even heard about it, and he died. So you would have thought to say, since it's very weakened, and the only thing that's left over after the father's death is very little, so for that little bit, I would say would be enough for Tafar the Chassan. That's the Kamash Malan of this case number 4, that no, the Chassan cannot be mafrid, because although the father really was never Zoich in this neder at all, because he never heard about it, what's called Nirulai, and therefore it's very weak, because the Chassan was mafrid, and he's still around. Even so, that's the Chiddush, that the Chassan cannot be mafrid, because that is a set halacha, that the Chassan cannot be made for a neder, but with a partnership with the father. And that's actually why, says the Ran, we say this wording of that ein abal meifel b'shutfis. We don't use the same wording we're saying throughout the Brayso. We don't say loy nisreik n'reshus lebal. We don't say that, as we said before, because in the cases over there, when the father had already heard about it, and he had some type of a zikui in it, and we're saying that his hafara is being mevatlet, so you could say, no, loy nisreikna, which would sound like that the father was zeiche, and now his rishus is not being emptied out to the chassan. But over here, the father was never zeiche at all. The father never heard about it. He didn't have anything over here. He didn't play a role at all. And the hafara of the chassan, you could say, was not batal because he didn't die. That's the chiddush. Even so, that's the set halacha that the chassan cannot be made for only if it's with a partnership. And the Ran explains that in this Bryce, up until this point, we had 4 categories. Spoke about 2 cases of when it was emptied out from the chassan to when he dies to the father, and 2 cases of when it does not get emptied out when the father dies to go to the chassan. And each one of these 4 cases, we said there's a chiddush, as we explained, and the orders are nisreikna, not nisreikna, nisreikna, not nisreikna. Now, case number 5, which is not so much, the last case is continuing top of Samach Testament Aleph, is Shama Aviyah v'Hafala. If her father heard about her neder, and he was made for it, well, his now the chassan didn't even get a chance to even hear about it at Shemeis, and then he died. So the halacha here is Chayzer Av u'Mefer Chelke Shabal. So the father goes back, and he nullifies the portion of the chassan. Now the Ran just points out, this that you said the word Chayzer, is not that the father has to be made for over what he himself was already made for, which is the portion of the father. The reason why we're saying the word chayzer is because he already was made for his own portion. Now he has to go back and be made for the portion of the chassan. But that's enough. And he doesn't have to go back and be made for his own portion because he didn't die. So even though the chassan dies, the father's hafar is not batal. So he just has to, but he could go ahead and be made for the portion of the chassan. Now, Amr Reb Nassan, he says, Heinin Divrei Beis Shammai. He says, what you just said is the opinion of Beis Shammai. And this actually, this really full circle what we asked before, regarding the machlekes, if it's Megiz Yayis or Mikdash Kalash, this is where we're getting to. This whole thing, very sophisticated brisa, was getting us to this point. Beis Shammai holds that the father can be made for in such a case, and it's enough for him to be made for just a portion of the chassan, because the father, like we said, since he didn't die, is not batal. But Beis Hillel Oimrim, Ein Yachal Lahafer. He cannot be made for at all, even if he goes back and he's made for his own portion and the portion of the husband. And he explains why. Shema Mina, what we infer from this, LeBeis Shammai, according to Beis Shammai, Megiz Gayis. What happens is when one of the parties does the afara, he cuts it in half. When the father was originally made for, he was made for only his chelik. The chelik of the chassan didn't get diminished at all. Rather, it remains as it was, and it's chashav enough, significant enough, for the father to inherit it, to have the halach of nisreikna. That's what Beis Shammai holds. And that's why Beis Shammai says, yeah, chayzer avim mefer chelke shabal. Well, the Beis Hillel miklash kalish. According to Beis Hillel, they say no, when one of the parties does afar, it weakens the whole thing. So when the father was made for his chelik, it also diminished the chelik of the chassan, because again, the klishas, the weakness, it affects the whole thing. So the words of the Ran are, it's not significant enough now anymore. It's too flimsy for the father to even inherit it. And since the father is still here, so his afar is not batal, but still the neder is very weak. And since it weakened, meaning because or else you would lose that weakness when he would die. No, he's still around. So his afara, which created the weakness, is still around. And since that weakened also the portion of the chassan, so it's not chashav enough to be merik, father cannot do a hafar. Now, however, the Ran says that's all talking about if she does not get engaged to someone else. But if she actually gets engaged to someone else that same day, then the father and the second chassan can be made for Nadarim, as we'll see in the Bryce Daf Ayin Aleph, as we'll explain over there. But says the Ran, this is the explanation of this sugya according to how I understand it. It says, I saw many rabbis that said things that they don't illuminate and it's not so clear. Wasn't even concerned of writing it because many times he writes other Rishonim. He says, no, Shema no, but this answers our original question, which we asked, which related to halacha of the Mishnah of via bal mafin nedereha. What's the halacha? Is it megid gayis or miklish kolish? So the Gemara, it's machlekes b'sham and b'sil, and that's what we see from the machlekes over here when shama via v'hafala. Father heard he was made for it. The last case, case number 5, and the chassan didn't hear about it, and he died. B'sham hold, the father could be made for it, a portion of the chassan. Why? Because it was megid gayis. His portion is still bona fide, is untainted. That's very significant for the father to inherit. But according to Basil, the whole thing was weakened when the father made his hafara, and the father's still around. The chassan died, so it's weak, it's too shvach, it's too flimsy. There's nothing for him to yarshin, and therefore he cannot be made for. That's because he was meklish kalash. That's machlokes b'shem. There's nothing into any time of hosting us.